They write tomes. They write tomes. By the way, The Way of Kings is here. Mistborn is here. The Name of the Wind is here. I will show you how those authors, however, do it properly. Welcome back to another episode of Why Why good writers do not get published, okay? Good writers exist. And every good writer that gets published eventually was once a bad writer. So the question is, why good writers don't get published? And in this particular video, we'll be talking about something that really terribly contributes to that particular problem, okay? And you can see it all in this first paragraph, okay? And on top of that, you see this first paragraph, the second paragraph, and then this third paragraph is the father of why good writers do not get published, right? Today we'll be checking the books, the chapters, chapter 1 analysis video sent by Ethan, as well as a great old friend of this channel, Hafiz. I'm not sure which it is, because in his Gmail he has the name Hafi, but in his YouTube it's Hafiz, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that this and this will not get published. I love Hafiz, you know. Hafi is a great friend of this channel. He's been around for a very long time. But you know, this is a critique and we have to keep it honest. Alright? That's the only way it can be useful. So first of all, let's start with Ethan, because he expresses this problem terribly. Right? Ethan is plagued. I mean, Ethan is really plagued by this problem. And if I was an editor, or if I was the writer, I would have to edit this out. Any basic editing skill will basically guarantee you the ability to spot that all of these walls of text are unnecessary and they have to be edited out. Let's quickly get through them in like 2-3 minutes. As you can see, this book starts out promisingly, okay? It's about a guy whose village was destroyed, and he is now on revenge, right? The crackling embers of a slowly dying fire become the only sound in the otherwise silent symphony of the night air. The light of heaven's scar, rushing in to fill everywhere shadows once danced, forcing them to retreat close to their source. Merwiz's placid stare, unchanging as he watched the shadows cower beneath his feet. How many times did it make now that he thought he could sense a breath coming from his own shadow? First of all, this initial chapter makes one big mistake, and it's that it does not establish in any way whatsoever a story. If you have a first paragraph, it should establish a story. But the problem we're talking about in this particular video is info dumping. And why info dumping will guarantee your book is a mess, right? And a messy mess. It goes on, this particular dialogue, you know, there's another girl with him, right? Who acknowledges that it's peaceful. Then, immediately, the author goes on an info dump. He couldn't remember the last time he got the chance to stop himself just to look at the stars. This is an immediate red flag for anyone who is trying to write anything. The primary reason why is because as a reader, I am not really interested in this guy, Merwiz, okay? Remember, you can always exposit as much as you like. Infamous authors or famous authors for this include, George R. Martin, Patrick Rothfuss, as well as Brandon Sanderson. They write tomes. They write tomes. By the way, The Way of Kings is here. Mistborn is here. The Name of the Wind is here. I will show you how those authors, however, do it properly. Because how to info dump properly is the question. Well, to do that, what you have to pull off is get me to care about the story or the plot or the character, right? I need to really care about the book. You just described shadows, the night, and how nice it is. I'm not really interested significantly in the story. Yeah, it's peaceful, but I need blood, right? I need a blood sacrifice. But on top of that, I need an interesting story. It doesn't have to always be bloody. it could be an interesting story, a quiet moment, a very deadly quiet moment, right? Once the audience cares about the story, then you can jump from that point and move to doing what? As much info dump as you would like. But he makes the mistake of immediately starting info dumps. But he admitted to himself the ocean of light was truly captivating. Well, okay, this information was established before. As you can see, this entire paragraph is how peaceful it is, right? So you don't really have to, explain it again. The heaven is a sky dividing the rainbow of stars like a snowy path. Bro, you described it before. The heavens light rushing in to fill everywhere shadows once danced. Again, the heavens is sky dividing. Look, the heaven is the sky is some heavenly body, okay? So the reality is, no need to do this. This moon, I'm assuming, it's night, right? It's fine. It's fine. No need to repeat the information. It reminded him of an epic that his elders would tell about celestial beings that battled among the stars and how the scar was the scattered remains of the battle. You see, this is already info dumped. I really don't care about this as a reader. And I don't mean to be an asshole. I'm trying to make this useful, okay? I'm trying to get the point to click for Ethan, all right? Ethan, bro, look. It reminded him of an epic that his elders would tell. Why should I care? It's a very simple question. This story, this character, it's actually by the end of the chapter, a very good story. Why do I say that? Because it's structurally sound, except for two things. Purple prose. You do a lot of purple prose, but on top of that, you also do very bad info dumping. The story is sound. The plot is literally sound. You have a guy, his village gets destroyed. He'll be telling us the story, right? I was just reminded of the past. This girl asks him to hear his story. So he'll tell us his story and how his village was destroyed and he's going for revenge. This is a good plot. It's a basic plot, but it's good nonetheless. It's clean. And the way it is structured and the basing is not bad. Everything is just damaged by two things. Purple prose, and on top of that, the terrible world building. Because here, it reminded him of an epic that his elders tell him, why should I care about this epic? I don't even know who this guy is. I don't know who this girl is. But that's not where the problems stop, right? Once he starts telling the story, once he starts telling the story, he stares at the girl. I suppose that's only fair, but I must warn you, my story, or rather my history, isn't as entertaining as you might think. It's dark, actually. This guy is really being nice, right? It's a very dark history. So this book has actually solid plot and solid world building. The world building is captivating, but you have to actually pay attention to it. You are not hooked first. This is it's interesting on its own. For example, if this was put in a Wikipedia journal, I would be interested. But in a book, you have to get the audience hooked first. That's why it's a cardinal sin. Even though he has good world building, he has bad info dumping. He doesn't know how to teach the people about his world, right? He goes on to talk about his story. Merus, he talks about his story. Birthdays weren't something usually celebrated in my village. I mean, that's very interesting, right? I'm a Somali. This is very interesting to me because we don't celebrate birthdays as well. Frankly, I don't even know exactly when I was born. No one cares. From what I remember, there were only a few events that would get celebrated. The birth of a child. Eventually, he explains the magic system, right? This was probably the biggest and most important event that would be celebrated for an individual. What's that? Every family had their own traditions and rituals, it seemed. But the couple would be focused of everyone's attention for the day. This is marriage, basically. This is to go back. So marriages, was probably the biggest and most important event. Moving from that point, he goes on in this paragraph to continue to explain the world. This is a Wikipedia journal. This is a World Anvil journal. World Anvil, basically, for those of you who don't know, is a world building website. And then he still continues. There was only one exception to this tradition for a warrior who was powerful. By the way, this is when you die, right? Instead, we would have a week-long celebration of life. So when someone dies, right? When someone dies, they don't mourn. We didn't mourn. They basically celebrate the person's life. I mean, this seems like it's describing my culture, but you know, exactly. We don't cry a lot. It's looked down upon. We celebrate the person's life. And then, but there was only one exception to this tradition. For a warrior who was powerful enough for their soul to remain in this realm. Upon their death, it wasn't something that happened often, mostly a handful of elders and the occasional talented warrior. But for anyone who was powerful enough, but you see, look, I don't care. This is good world building. As you can see on its own, judge this. I challenge you to look me in the face and tell me this is not interesting. Tell me that this is not captivating. Tell me that this is bad world building. This is why I say Ethan is a good writer. Ethan has the potential to blossom into a good writer. He simply has to figure out two things. Purple prose, inefficient word economy, as we mentioned in the beginning, right? And finally, terrible world building. You'd think he would stop. No. He gives us this paragraph, 1 and 2. These are 2 paragraphs of exposition and info dumps. And then he begins telling his story. Okay. Do you remember what you said here? You started your story here. So you were supposed to hook me with your story. Maybe with this paragraph and this paragraph, get me to care about the human conflict. And then what do you do? What do you do? Here you start info dumping perhaps. And you give perhaps a paragraph of info dumping. And then later, in next sub-chapters, you give more info dumps. But remember, don't be hasty. You are a writer. You are supposed to play the long game. A writer needs to be consistent. Never forget, you are never in shortage of paragraphs. A writer will write in a given book 100,000. This is a fantasy epic, right? Or something like that. So you have 100,000 words, 150,000 words, maybe 200,000 words. Don't be hasty. You can explain it at some point. You don't have to cram it into the first paragraph. In the first paragraph, you have to teach people about your character and get them to care. By the way, the Way of Kings, the Mistborn, the Name of the Wind, and Hafi, we will explore how they do it better. But it still goes on. Here, an actual story begins. I was somewhat familiar with a version of this story my grandmother would tell me. Bro, the elders explained how my grandfather... This is all info dump. This is all exposition. I really think this is the wrong way to structure this. It's badly structured. The author is rushing to exposit about his world. Don't assume that people will read your book for your awesome world building. People will only read your story for something that hooks them, a human conflict at its heart. So you need to have human character conflict or plot conflict. Hafi owns it. He solves all the problems with Ethan's writing. Fundamentally, Hafi makes sure that you are interested in the human conflict first. We are introduced to a hectic situation. The cost of truth. The stench of unwashed bodies mixes with the dead and dying, but I barely notice it. First of all, this establishes a story. But when you take a look at the opening paragraph here, this is a description that does not establish any human conflict or any story whatsoever. It ends with a question, but that question is never as impactful. There are 2 options here. Do you end with a question, or do you end with a description? Do you start, with a question here, or do you start with this? This at the end of the day is much more efficient. And let's talk about, that's just a much better beginning. But on top of that, the main narrative here is info dumping and bad world building. Bad world building in the case of just, info dumping. All right. This story does not have as good of a world building. Hafi actually is doing a Chernobyl. It's really not that significant, right? Chernobyl was a slaughterhouse. He's not doing an impressive world building situation. It's in our real world, and you can read most of it in books or in articles. This story, right? This story has better world building. This story from Hafi has worse world building. But I would rather read the Hafi book, The Cost of Truth, rather than read this chapter. Because this chapter, it takes the good world building it has and it turns it into text, okay? Like a school textbook. But this story has conflict, it has taste, it has the spices, man, okay? It's like a very beautiful dish of human suffering, okay? And then you have, the cost of truth. Let's read this, for a while to see its advantages, right? Focus is paramount. This is a doctor. I let the static buzz of the hospital room drown out the cries of the crush of people in the hallway outside. Lights mounted overhead flicker erratically and wash over everything in a sick, greenish glow. The man I operate on lays before me on the stretcher, a dozen other patients to either side. The towel a nurse presses on his arm has soaked through, so I instruct her to remove it. Tiny loops of cotton are matted with blood, a rusty varnish that seems alien in the green light. I mean, let's be honest, this is brilliant. I mean, the first sentence in terms of prose is kind of weak, but ultimately this puts you in a situation. This puts you in a human situation. Now I care, actually. What happened? What's going on? You know what you could do? Straight from the 4th paragraph. Here, Hafi could actually exposit and give info dumps. But of course, maybe give 1 paragraph of it and a small short paragraph. After every time you get me hooked on the human conflict, you get the privilege to do what? Info dump. Why? Because I now would like to know more. I am hooked. I would like to know more. I would like you to exposit. The nurse gasps. The patient's arm looks as if it has grown a mouth that vomits blood. Frothy bubbles popping and spitting. Mottles of black and white run down his bare skin like mold, and even I feel queasy at the sight. He mutters something nonsensical through swollen lips, ramblings born of painkillers and a fever dream. This is, first of all, the prose here, it has a good balance, right? Unlike in here, the prose is efficient. It is direct. It doesn't repeat itself. You remember, as we talked about before, the author explains, heaven's sky here and what it is, and then he goes about it again. Of course, he uses it in here to transition what it reminded him. But this transition itself shouldn't exist. That's the problem, right? That's the problem, isn't it? This transition at all should not exist. Something else should be there. And so what should be there, you might ask? Well, here, I'll show you what should be there. For example, when his village gets attacked. When his village gets attacked, we can go all the way down here, right? His village gets attacked here. And I wasn't sure if I had angered, my body burned as I felt cold mark coating. So his village is being attacked here, in here. I did really see it happen, but suddenly the air changes. Yes. So here's when his village gets attacked by the enemy. And the air changes and the sky begins to violently shake before an unimaginable pressure crashes down on everything. I hear the creaking of wood. Well, what should have happened was that this should have been closer to the beginning, if not the beginning. What could have been before this? You could have had something before this, and this would have been perhaps establishing how, this boy, this little boy, he's basically, that trope in young adult books or in fantasy books where the protagonist initially doesn't have any magical power. Well, this is this guy. And so as you can see in this particular paragraph, I was somewhat familiar with a version of the story my grandmother would tell me about how I was the smallest baby she had ever seen, and how she was too scared to even pick me up sometimes, even of fear of crushing me. Because of this, she would often tell me that I wasn't allowed to cultivate. Cultivation or cultivating is the magic system here, okay? Or train outside of, of morning exercises, because with my already weak constitution, it would only lead to further damage, right? So he can't really do magic because he's too weak. His village gets destroyed and eventually he has to become stronger. It's a very strong plot. Basic, but hey, there's nothing wrong with basic. Almost every book has a basic plot if you really think about it. So fundamentally, establishing this in an active, action, direct, in the moment scene, rather than telling us, maybe show him being weak. A lot of this is just telling, right? You are info dumping the story instead of writing the story. Hafi doesn't make that mistake. He tells the story instead of info dumping the story. Imagine if Hafi wrote here, I remember Chernobyl was a disaster. There were many dying people. Alright, bye-bye now. It would never be equivalent to having this particular paragraph. You know, this paragraph is beautiful because of this guy, the towel that presses to his nurse. It showcases the complete, insanity, the human suffering. And it shows you directly and it puts you in the situation. So you are info dumping the story that you should be telling. And once you tell this story, I'll be very interested to see this boy, him being weak, then eventually becoming stronger. And so I will be okay with exposition dumps later when he starts exercising. In here, there is a human connection established. Info dumps don't occur until much later. Imagine if Hafi in this particular case showed us or exposited the medical techniques the way, for example, Ethan did. Because that would be the equivalent. The only equivalent for Hafi to mess it up as much as Ethan would be to essentially exposit here about the medical techniques that are being used and how to inject people with a needle. Okay? Basically take something interesting, a very tense human conflict, and turn it into a medical textbook. Okay? Because that's what happened here. Ethan took interest in world building and he turned it into textbook. Congratulations, you messed it up. Okay, let's talk about The Way of Kings. I really like The Way of Kings, as you can tell. But at the same time, I really love how this is a very good example to learn from, because Brandon Sanderson will have to do copious amounts of expositing, but he gets you along with the journey every time. Brandon Sanderson is famous. In fact, he's infamous for doing textbook info dumps. He never makes it any more interesting. He just tells you directly what things are. But before he does that, he always uses the formula I just described. Get the audience to care about the story and establish a human connection, right? For example, Kalak here is a herald. In the case of Ethan here, if Brandon Sanderson was like Ethan, he would start by explaining in the second paragraph or the third paragraph what the heralds are. But instead, what Sanderson does is what Hafi does. Basically, he establishes, a conflict. Kalak rounded a rocky stone ridge and stumbled to a stop before the body of a dying thunderclast. A dying thunderclast. That's the key note here. The enormous stone beast. See, Brandon Sanderson establishes the keyword, and then he doesn't abandon it. He sticks with it. Lay on its side. Rib-like. Protrusions. So at the end, this entire chapter, for example, this conversation between the heralds, they show me one moment when Brandon Sanderson explains the Knight's Radiant. Because who carried the Knight's Radiant? It's the heralds. But he never actually exposits about the Knight's Radiant. He never exposits about Odium and all the big gamers. And all the big players in this game. Never. He just stays focused on the human conflict here and the suffering. And you have in Mistborn, for example, we have Vin, and the magic system. You know, for example, we see that Kelsey uses his allomatic powers here. And allomatic power surged through his body, enhancing his senses. What's allomatic power? He doesn't explain it, because he doesn't have to. What's the point of this prologue? This entire prologue is actually trying to get you to care and to emotionally connect with the Scar. The Scar as a people, right? Ash fell from the sky. Lord Tristan, it starts with the oppressor from the get-go, frowned, glancing up at the ruddy midway sky. As his servants scuttled forward. The key here is the servant. He's trying to really get you to root for the Scar. He could explain what the Scar are, but he doesn't really explain that. It's kind of obvious. They are the oppressed people. But who are the oppressed people? He never really explains it in this prologue. He could explain the magic system, allomancy, but he doesn't really explain it. However, we see allomancy show up in this prologue. Moreover, a bit later, as you can see, she expended just a smidgen, right? All she knows that luck, her luck, you know, it can run out and it regenerates over time. She would need to, you know, for the rest of the job. She directed the luck at calming his nervousness. So you can tell that there's some magic going on here, and this magic has a currency, and it can run out, and it can replenish. It can be replenished. You don't know what and how. So I don't want to really spoil anymore, but this magic system is literally treated as this keyword here. Luck. Okay, this magic is luck, but it's an actually hard system magic. Okay, it's a hard magic system, and it has concrete steps as to what it is and how it works. It's basically more like a science rather than luck. But Sanderson does not want you to really know about the luck. What he wants you to know is Vin. He wants you to root for Vin, right? Care about Vin and the Scar people, because what's the freaking, and also Kelsier. But in the beginning prologue, he could actually go forth and explain Kelsier, his backstory, who he is, his wife at the Hathpin. But he never really does that, does he? He never does that, because he's not really trying to do the cardinal mistake that Ethan here is making. What instead Sanderson is trying to do is get you to care about the people and the characters and the human conflict. We can see a similar theme in The Name of the Wind, where there's so much to exposit here. There is so much to exposit. Oof, Giga Chad, Bachikrotvus. There's so much to exposit. Look at this, bro. Look at this. There's so much to exposit. And there's so much to exposit about the magic system. But it doesn't happen until, you know, after you are hooked, alright? It doesn't happen until after you're hooked. And you are hooked because it was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts, right? And the last silence, you can, you know, the third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wooden floor underfoot and in the rough, splintering barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the black stone hearth that held the heat of a long dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth rubbing along the grain of the bar. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he moved with the subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, trapping the others inside itself. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river smooth stone. It was the patient cut flower sound of a man who was waiting to die. So you want to know who's waiting to die. Chapter 1, a place for demons. Let's figure out why. So any exposition that happens here, it doesn't matter, because you are properly enticed. You care about the conflict and you would like to know more about it. So you can see how these professional authors do, they do as demonous and as heavy of an info dump as everyone else. The only difference is that they basically get you interested in the story first, and then they expose it until you die. Okay, Sanderson is infamous. I mean, The Way of Kings here, I have praised it, but holy God, look at this. It's 1,014 pages. Okay, and that's in the PDF format. This is a heavy tome. This is a heavy tome that can kill entire families. All right. So there you go. This is going to be our video rating these two chapters. I would say from Hafi, The Cost of Truth is the winner. All right. And it is better. It is not only does it have better word economy, but it has better prose. It has better structure. It has better basing. And, the best of all, unlike Ethan, this chapter actually has great use of info dumping. Basically, it doesn't info dump as badly as Ethan here. And remember, who has the better world building? Ethan has the better world building. Ethan has the better world building. It has much, much more to offer. And ultimately, all of that is wasted and turned into a boring textbook. I mean, this was great, but it's been ruined. So that's going to be the final thing. You can send in my email basically your chapter 1, and I'll add you to the chapter 1 analysis. Have a nice day. Bye bye.